Good evening, everybody. Hi. I'm trusting you can hear me in this new world we have here. My name is Mike Scott. I'm the program director at Farm Table Foundation. We've got a great group of folks here, about 20 people joining us with Leslie for this goat raising basics class. Our mission at Farm Table is to build local food culture. And so we do that in a variety of ways. One of them offering these classes, and then we have a restaurant. We get the majority of our food from very local farms, including Leslie's, have goat products from Leslie. And our mission to build local food culture, we do that through building community, through supporting conservation, and then teaching the craft around local food, whether it's cooking or growing or preserving local foods. And Leslie's one of those farmers that we interact with and buy from. So Leslie, it's great to have you here. She's the owner, proprietor of Cylon Rolling Acres. Welcome again, everybody. Glad you're here. Leslie, take it away.
All right, thanks, Mike, and welcome, everybody. My name is Leslie Svacina, and I own the farm Cylon Rolling Acres. I'm outside of Deer Park. So if you're familiar with it, the Farm Table Foundation, we're about 15 minutes or so from Amory, Wisconsin, or northwestern Wisconsin if you're not from Wisconsin. So, but before I get started, I really want to take this opportunity to thank Mike and the Farm Table Foundation for partnering with me on this class. The Farm Table has been a great partner for our farm and in a lot of other farms in our area. They do an excellent job promoting local food, not just with our farm, but also again with my other fellow farming colleagues who are raising livestock and produce in our area. You know, he'd mentioned we use their meat in our restaurant, and they do. We've partnered in the past for celebrating Goattober, which is all things goat, but especially celebrating goat meat in October coming up next month. So, first, just to kind of test out our chat box, I'd like to know just quickly, if you're able to, in the comments, why you're here tonight for the class, and if you have goats, what kind you have. So it doesn't need to be anything long, but maybe just a sentence or two, just to give me an idea of where all of you are at right now with goats and your interest for this class.
I'll summarize these as they come in. No goats want to learn more. Looking to control poison ivy and buckthorn with adorable goats. Looking to adopt Nigerian dwarf goats. To start a goat yoga company. No goats yet. Maybe you can see them too there.
I just pulled it up, so.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, thank you, and I'll see if they kind of pop up as we get going. Okay.
Oh, there's someone from Texas, from Illinois.
Okay.
Welcome to those not from Wisconsin or Minnesota. Delight to have you with us.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. All right, so give me a minute. I'm just going to close this out. Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit about my background with our farm and then get into content, just to give you a context of where I'm at with things. But as Mike had mentioned, as we go along, feel free to ask questions. Mike will kind of help manage the chat box for me. And we can also have time to answer questions at the end. So if for some reason we might miss something, we can go back and make sure we cover some of that. And I will do my best to answer questions as well as I know, but if I am not familiar with some of those answers, I will try to find resources to share with you afterwards. I think Mike has a contact list from all of your registration. So as much as I'd like to say I know everything about goats, that's, you know, it's like everything, you know, you can't be it's just not possible. So I'll do my best. So.
And Leslie, after tomorrow or so, folks, or Saturday soon, I'll send out a recording of this so you can always review it. And then also with that, Leslie will have, I believe, a handout of some resources that will also be helpful to you.
Exactly. Thanks, Mike, for reminding me of that. So just a little bit of background about our farm. We're in northwestern Wisconsin. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our area, we're about maybe an hour from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. My husband and I purchased our farm about 10 years ago, And a few years after that, we started getting established raising goats. And so right now we have a herd of about 40 breeding stock of Boer Kiko cross goats. At a high, we had probably about 130 goats. At one time we were raising dairy buck kids, so male dairy goats for meat as well, to help have some more meat on hand. Since that time, a couple years ago, we phased out of that. And then we also have 3 livestock guardian dogs. We pasture all of our whole herd, so they're rotationally grazed all summer long, and then in the winter time they're fed hay. And so for our area, it's maybe a little bit more unique management practice, but I'm just sharing the perspective of where we're at. So all of our goats are used for meat, obviously with the exception of our breeding stock. We're selling, all of our meat is sold direct. So we have our 2 kind of areas of customers, our individual customers. So we sell locally, and also just started a shipping program. So we've been able to sell and share our meat with a larger community than just here in Western Wisconsin and the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And then we also work with wholesale accounts. I'd call that more regional wholesale accounts, like the Farm Table restaurant here. They buy our goat, and we work with some other retail locations that buy our meat as well. And then we also, I'd say our customer base is pretty diverse in terms of cultural market, but also is a mix. The area that's also growing too is folks who are interested in where their food comes from, the local grass foods market, and there's obviously some crossover in those markets as well. So. But that gives you an idea of where my background is. So as I share things a lot, just know that my perspective has been predominantly on the meat side of things in terms of goats, but there's a lot of similarities in management practices. And as you probably have learned, if you're interested in goats, there's not a lot of resources out there in terms of research and university information. And so that's where I've gone to look at some what my fellow dairy goat colleagues are doing, and look for ways that I can utilize and learn from folks who are raising even other species of livestock as well. So I'm going to jump into my presentation. So give me a minute while I move into my screen share here. Okay. Can you see my screen? If you can give me a thumbs up. All right, perfect.
Looks good to me, yep.
Thank you. All right, I'm just gonna move this page. Okay, I just moved your faces so I can see. So today I'm gonna be covering kind of a very high level basics of raising goats with a lot of resources to point you in different directions depending where your interest is at and where your background is. When I was preparing for this class, I spent a little bit of time getting feedback from folks who are through social media on what people are interested in. And some of the topics really probably can merit a whole class on their own. So know that as I cover things, this is probably a high level class. And then I'll touch on some of the different opportunities with goats, and then also tips for marketing, because I have had some questions about about direct marketing in that regard. This is really focused for the farmer or homesteader looking to add goats or get started. I know some of you talked about brush management, and I would consider that being part of this group as well. If you're here and you're interested in goats and maybe as a pet or something like that, that's totally fine. But I just want you to know kind of the angle I'm taking with the focus of this class. And so we talked a little bit about questions as well, so we'll cover that. All right, so let me get. So the first part, the basics of raising goats. These are some of the topics that I will touch on in terms of their characteristics as animals, some of their basic needs, and also some information regarding health practices and also grazing, because that's a tool that we utilize on our farm. So on to the very basics. Knowing that we might have a range of folks who, depending, are maybe a little at different stages with learning about goats or owning goats, starting to raise goats. Goats are herd animals, and so it's really best that if you are going to own goats, you need to at least have 2 of them, potentially more. or they're living with another, let's say another species of livestock. So maybe they live with your cattle, or they're a companion animal for a horse that you might have. They really do best having buddies. So I guess you could probably say maybe it's a good reason to, a good selling point to maybe if your partner, other people in your family, about owning more than one. In terms of terminology, you can take a look at here. You can see it here on the screen, but bucks and does are the adult terminology for male and female. Kids, that's a name for young goats. Use the terminology kidding for when they have babies. Doelings and bucklings are the gender-specific terms for the young goats, and then wethers are the male goats that are castrated, so they're unable to breed. There's more than 100 breeds of goats that exist, and here's just obviously this is not a comprehensive list because I just mentioned, there's a lot of different breeds, but these are some of the common breeds. Some of you may even, if you have goats already or you're looking at potentially purchasing some, you may have a favorite breed that may not be in here, but this gives you an idea of some of the breeds that are focused on dairy, in the meat area, and even in fiber. And you'll find too that many breeds, there are some breeds that may be multi-purpose. So for example, Nubian may tend to be more dairy, but this has a little bit thicker body structure that potentially could be dual purpose for meat. Cashmere goats, the way that they grow their fiber, it's in the winter time, so their fiber is harvested by brushing. So like they maybe could have more potential to be in the brush, in brushwork, or potentially even meat if you're looking at how you manage breeding with kids. So and of course, just because something is, let's say a breed is under the dairy, for example, La Mancha, it doesn't mean that it couldn't be used in another purpose. So for example, when we were raising dairy buck kids, the male dairy goats, we were raising them for meat. And so obviously, they can be used in different capacities. So on a very high level, in terms of animal selection basics. So these are some things to keep in mind. You probably have seen, or maybe you'll take a look at it in the future. There's some lists of things to look at in terms of animal characteristics, in terms of looking at hooves and teeth structure and body structure. Depending on what kind of animal or what kind of breed or what your goal is for your goats. But these are some more kind of broader suggestions I typically will suggest to folks who are newer with goats, and even just in general when I look at bringing animals into the herd. So it's really thinking about what are your goals for your herd. For example, it can get pretty exciting when you find a pretty neat goat and you're like, you really love the color, but it's easy to forget, they've got great coloring, but you forget about thinking about, what other pieces will that, just because they look pretty, will they perform for what your goals are? And so kind of keeping that in mind. Sometimes from my perspective, I found that seeking out animals from similar management practices is almost more important than getting maybe specific breeds or a specific look just right. Obviously, you want to have certain characteristics, but those similar management practices are really going to make a difference for helping set your herd up for success, how you might be utilizing them. So an example with that is our goats are all raised on pasture. We've continued to try to build a stronger herd that's more resilient and hardier on pasture. And part of that process now is we have invested in some bucks that are from another farm that does rotational grazing practices as well. So, and they have been a nice fit for our farm. So that's just an example when you think about management practices. You can take a look at in terms of how the herd is managed on the farm, in terms of feeding, parasite management practices, seeing how they're raised before you purchase them. And so sometimes that can be where you're actually on the farm, or maybe if a farm is pretty, it does a good job in terms of showing how they're farming or raising their animals through social media, you might get a good feel that way as well. And also in general, being aware of the signs of a healthy goat. I think we all have intentions of purchasing healthy goats, but it's good to have that on the radar when you're looking at animals, when you kind of combine it of the excitement of adding animals to your herd. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those signs for healthy goats. And then this last one, or second to last one is, when you're looking at bringing new animals into your herd, it's important to really look at how it's good to start small if you're new to goats or even livestock, to get a feel of how of managing the life cycle of a goat and what to watch for. But then when you start to build your herd, I really encourage people to avoid adding one goat here and there. And it doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal, but all of our goats tend to be they do well. In general, they thrive in the environments that they're raised in. And it doesn't mean that they couldn't thrive in another environment, but if you're but there are, little things that your goats may be accustomed to or have become more resilient that's unique to your farm. And that's the same with other herds. And so if you're bringing in an animal here and there, you're continually adding some stress to your livestock herd or the new goats you're bringing in. And so you don't want to, taking that approach kind of helps minimize kind of maybe extra unneeded health challenges getting your new herd adjusted with new animals coming in. Obviously, if you're bringing in some breeding buck, a new breeding buck, that's something that you can't really avoid, but it's a good suggestion, the one that I've learned even over time as well. And then if you bring in new animals, it's always good practice to quarantine them. Of course, that's like a terminology that we're probably all a part of now with the day and age where we're at, but really, keeping them in a separate pen for about 30 days, just so you can just make sure that there's nothing that's concerning as you get used to having them, or even just monitoring them, getting adjusted to your feeding practices versus maybe what they were at another farm. So those are some practices when you think about bringing an animal onto your farm. All right. So onto the basic needs. Just like us, water, shelter, and food is really important. And water, I think, goes without explanation, but I'll just point out here on the picture. So this is an example of a water tank we have out on pasture. This has a seasonal water line to it. It's a 60-gallon low stock tank. We really like these because a lot of younger animals can access them. In the winter time, sometimes when we have younger goat kids, we will put cinder blocks. They can get up and access the water. But those are, that kind of covers the water component, but it's important that they always have access to water, which I think is, again, explanatory. In terms of housing and shelter requirements for goats. So goats don't like being wet. Doesn't mean they can't handle a little bit of rain, but they seem to do better with having some access to shelter. And this is probably a little bit different than what you might see if you're familiar with other species of livestock. So if you were to see like sheep or cattle out on pasture, they do pretty well out in the elements. And our goats do pretty well too, but goats are just a little bit different, maybe a little bit more finicky in that regard. And so it's something that we need to take into consideration. So what you might have for pasture shelter might look a little different than, let's say, what you have. Let's say if you have a barn, if your goats are going to live in the barn, or at least maybe your winter housing. And so part of that is just because they have more space to roam. So if you look on the picture here, you can see some examples of what we have for pasture shelter. There's some huts that we built. And then also, because we live in Wisconsin, we have a lot of access to dairy, used dairy equipment. And so we also utilize group calf hutches, and we put those on skids and we move them with our gator. But depending on your pasture, I know a number of you were talking about the interest in doing brush work. If there's enough shelter from brush and trees, that may be enough too as well if they're out in the elements. Right now our goats are on a brushy paddock around our pond, and they don't have any extra shelter. The trees are enough to give them some cover, enough cover to give them protection. If you're looking at what you might need for housing recommendations, there's facility space recommendations here you can take a look at. And again, this I'll share this with you as well afterwards. These large And then within the barn, I'd recommend large group pens with multiple feeders. The multiple feeders is nice because once you start to have more goats, there's always one that likes to be in charge, and then there's always one that's kind of on the bottom of the the hierarchy of the goats. And so by having multiple feeders, you take less stress off of it. So that way, your goat that's kind of on the bottom of the ranking still has access to eat and doesn't run into issues that way. You may consider, as your herd grows, you may want some other large pens to split groups off. So for example, when we get ready for kidding season, we will take out our does, we'll wean off our does from, or doelings, our kids from this last spring, into a separate pen because we won't have them in the big pen during breeding or out on pasture during breeding. And that'd be the same too with our goats that we'll use for that go to market. Small pens really aren't necessary for individual goats. If you think of it from the perspective if they're herd animals, they like to be around other goats, but they are nice to have some options if you are going to be for kidding time. We will use those at that point to address health needs, or even if you can just we have some panels that we can just put up in the barn for that time of year, and then we take them down. One thing I'll show it at the end, but I have some books that I'll recommend as resources. I don't want to bounce back and forth between I guess I'll give it a try quick and see. Oh, you know what? I will do it after. I've been getting good at doing Zoom, but I haven't presented in Zoom yet. So I don't want to lose the presentation. So, all right. So in terms of fencing, I know it wasn't on the fencing kind of on the basic needs, but I think if you've talked to probably anybody that you're interested in raising goats, people probably say, oh, fencing is always the hot topic that comes up with it. And that was something that was really important to us when we got started, was having good fence. I knew that from the start. And so it's a worthwhile investment to make sure you have it done right, no matter how you might be, taking on, how you might be, whether it's a small yard, if you just have a small setup, or you're looking at grazing, or even doing brush work. And so for our permanent, setting up our perimeter fence with portable paddock fencing is ideal. And so a paddock, when I talk about that, is you have your big pasture, but then you break it down into a small section and do a paddock. And that's what you're using your portable fencing. And I'll show some pictures in just a little bit. And so what we use is woven wire with a high tensile at the top. So it's a strand of hot wire on the top and then a strand of barbed wire on the bottom. And the woven wire is nice because the goats, can't climb through it then if you had, let's say, like a 3 or a 5 strand fence. The hot wire on top is nice because it keeps our guardian dogs from going out, and it keeps predators from coming in for the most part, or at least so far. And then on the bottom is the barbed wire, and that prevents digging, for the same purposes with our dogs and also predators as well. If you already have existing fence, 5 wire could work if it's hot enough and there's enough to eat. Sometimes if the goats have a reason, to get out to another side, that can be enough to help them, encourage them to sneak out. If it's hot, not all the fence needs to be electrified, but there could be an issue, with 5 strand, if you have the bottom electrified, to kind of help train them to stay back. There could be maybe sometimes some grounding issues just because of grass growing. That's where the high tense or the woven wire sometimes is a benefit. If you're fencing, in a small area, the idea still applies. Cattle panel could work. We've started some of our original pens in our barn, our cattle panel with boards. There's nothing that says that you couldn't use that for fencing outside as well. Gates, we utilize the tube gates, but added it on cattle panel. You can get gates with mesh. We found they just weren't as sturdy as the traditional cattle gates. That's why we took that modification. And then with grazing, and this would be something that maybe for some of you who talk about or interested in brush work, you may be interested as well. But our portable paddock fencing is how we subdivide our pasture into smaller areas. And it gives us more flexibility to have the portable fencing and more permanent fencing, because based on the seasonality, This time of year, we have much larger paddocks because our pasture isn't growing as much. In the springtime, we do smaller paddocks because there's much more lush. It also gives us flexibility depending on our herd size. And so our fencing that we use in there is the smart fence, and then the Premier is one electronet fence. And I'll just bump I'll just bump forward, and then I'll talk about the Energizer. Okay, where did I go? All right, here we go. This is the pictures where I wanted to show. So the one on the left is the smart fence Gallagher's. This one I really like a lot because it's easy to use. It is a multi-reel system with 4 strands of hot wire and then built-in fence posts. It works really well inside of our paddock. I think if we've used it outside of our perimeter fence, which is what you can see here on the right, just to give you an example of what we're using for woven wire and the hot wire on the bottom. And you can't see the barbed on the bottom. Some of the barbed wire is even buried, not intentionally, but it's just the way it worked over the years. And then the center one is the electronet fence that we use as well too. And the electronet fence is, we have purchased ours from Premier One. There's a number of other companies too that utilize them, and Premier One has a lot of different options. But we originally started with the electronet fence, and it moved to the smart fence because it's a lot easier to use. But now that we're doing more brush management work outside of our existing fence, I really like using that Premier or that electronet fence just because there's a little less risk for having a fence go down or deer knocking it down, or and there's more visibility in terms of the goats and the dogs staying back from it. So I'm just going to back up. Okay, so along with the fence is a strong energizer. You know, it should always be hot and on. Sometimes we found that a larger energizer works better than maybe what initially seemed to work well, or what was quoted for our farm, just because we were running a lot more electrified wire than maybe what somebody who might be grazing cattle might be, and so that seemed to help us carry more energy that way. And then there's some just advice here from Langston University on some of the measurement for the output. And I would say too, if you are going to use electric fence, make sure you train them and teach them to respect it, and just don't assume they'll learn. We retrain every spring, and it really makes a big difference. It can be once in a while we will bring it. We may have some goats that weren't trained on it, and it's a headache, and it just make sure you put the time in, and it'll be well worth your trouble. And once in a while there's a repeat offender, and he or she may have to meet they'll teach the other goats, so what not to do. And so sometimes that means it might be a management decision on retiring on that goat, but typically that's not the case. Training usually helps quite a bit. Okay, let's see here. All right, so I showed pictures of fence already. And so throughout this, as I talk about different areas, I'll show these resources. And so some of these I may talk to a little bit. Otherwise, the rest of these we'll share this with the information that we send out afterwards. So I have on my blog, you'll find a lot of other resources on there as well. But I have an article that I wrote about how we fence train our goats. Premier One and Gallagher, even though I know they're trying to sell things, they have some pretty good resources on their website as well too. And I would say with electric fence, it can be intimidating for folks, but if you are, to get started with, it's a great tool. And so if you're a little unsure on getting started, some of these resources can help you kind of get the groundwork for it, but don't be afraid to reach out to, a fencing professional to get advice on what you should use, and then get that part done right in terms of the right energizer and so forth. All right, so I'm gonna move into basic feed needs. So goats are, most of you probably be familiar with this, but they're small ruminants, so they have a 4-compartment stomach. That means they digest really in short. This is one of those topics we probably could have many classes on this, but in short, their digestive process is really different than a simple stomach like we have, and so their dietary preferences, you can see here, it's forages, forbs, and browse, and so most of it is browse, and actually they're much more similar in their diet, in their dietary preference to white-tailed deer than even sheep or cattle. So it's kind of interesting little facts. So when I am when we've looked at enhancing our pastures, we really look at like what food plots for deer, what they utilize, and use some of that as an approach for feeding. But in terms of feeding goats, there can be different ways to approach that. So there's pasture or forage base. That'd be, for where we live in Wisconsin, we don't have the luxury. I think like some of you I think someone was in Texas where we get snow. So at some point we have to start feeding hay, but we are the approach of pasture and hay is our feed source. But there are methods, and a lot of people will feed hay or pasture or pasture depending on the year, and then the time of year, and then supplement with grain. And so there's different approaches to that depending on what your goals are. And depending on how you feed is going to be different, depending on how you're raising your goats, depending on their classes, so whether it's bucks, does, if they're in milk, or if they're young kids growing. So, for our farm, when we make our own hay, but when we were purchasing hay, because we're in Wisconsin, we found that we call dairy quality hay. So it's kind of a mix of grass and alfalfa, seemed to really work well for our goats, because all of our goats were always in kind of working mode, not maintenance. So either we were growing meat, or they were growing babies, or feeding babies. And that just seemed to really work well for us versus like straight grass. Doesn't mean that that grass couldn't work, but that might be better for goats who might be, more in maintenance mode and aren't, it really bases on how you're using those animals. In terms of some differences, if you're feeding like a forage base or a pasture base feeding system, that it's going to take longer for gains. If you're looking at raising goats for meat, it may not work as well, or it may need to be modified for how you utilize that type of feeding process with dairy goats that are milking. It doesn't mean it can't be done, but you might just need to take a look at it from a little different angle. One of the next page, okay, so this resource page, just to point out a couple of things for follow-up. This cooperative extension. Yes.
I just had a couple of questions come in.
Yeah, sure.
Well, one kind of went back to training the goats. Just what are the details on training the goats?
Yep.
And then also, someone just asked about, so dairy hay works well. This person's in Minnesota.
Yep. So, okay. So, I'll do the easy. Well, the first one, the fencing one. So when we do fence training in the springtime, what I will do is I will set up a small area outside of our barn with our fence, and just make a small kind of loop with the electric fence. So, and then I'll usually do it in the afternoon, so they've had some time to eat hay. So that way their rumen is still full of dry matter, because if they eat too much, part of the other thing too, getting adjusted to being on pasture or fresh forage, whether that's trees or brush, is that getting their rumen adjusted to the lush pasture. It's kind of like if you get really excited and we don't want our goats to gorge themselves. So part of that is having some hay in their tummy first, so they don't eat too much. But then the other piece then is we have a small, like a half circle of fence out, and it may depend on your herd size. It could be bigger, but I want something big enough that they can get out there and eat the grass, but big enough that I can watch that they may bump their nose into the fence. And then if it's a newer group of goats, I may put a second, do another portable fence around that. So this is what the portable fence is. So 2 layers of portable fence, just so that way if somebody gets zapped, it doesn't hurt, but it's definitely shocks them. If they jump out, then it's a little easier for me to corral them, but I usually will have my husband around, or my kids, and they'll kind of keep an eye on them too. So what I'll do then is I'll watch, they'll come out and they'll be super excited about eating the grass. Eventually the older does kind of know what's going on, but the younger kids or the yearlings either have to learn or be remembered. And so I'll make sure, I'll kind of take a note on who gets a little zap. And so I try to make sure that all the young stock and the yearlings from last season have at least kind of experienced it once or twice. And so I'll let them in. They'll be in there maybe for like a max is for like an hour or whatever time I need to be, I'm willing to spend some time there, and then I'll put them back in the barn. And then the next day I'll do it again. And then after a few days, once I've noticed that most of the young stock kind of understand what the fence is there for and how it works, then I'll start letting them out on a paddock. Then they'll be just about ready to go on a paddock. I still keep an eye on the young animals the first few weeks just because they're still learning, but it really helps to if the kids are with the does that their moms, they learn from them, but it also is good for them to kind of have that kind of like Pavlov's responsive training. So that's the approach we've done, and that seems to really help. And every year it's easier just because we have fewer goats to watch, but it's still good just to have that practice. Hopefully that answered the question. If you got more specifics on wanting to know that, let me know. And then on the hay, if you're from Minnesota, I think about dairy cow quality hay, versus like just a grassy mix. So if it's grassy alfalfa, even probably more alfalfa tends to, we've seen that they tend to do better on, at least from our experience with like what our goals are for our farm. So. Okay, go back. Is there anything else, Mike, or is that what we got for right now?
Yeah, that's it for now. Someone else did mention they're interested in guardian dog info as well, but yep. No specific questions, and perhaps we can come back to that at the end of the class as well.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you brought that up. So when I talk a little bit about grazing, I'll talk a little bit about guardian dogs at that point, but if I don't, remind me, and whoever asked that question, and I'll talk about that at the end as well. So just a note on here for the nutrition resources, if you're looking for a little bit of guidance in terms of type of feed or how much, or if you're going to supplement with some grain, this feeding different classes of goats from cooperative extension, it's kind of a collaboration of like all state extension agencies, has a pretty decent guide that give you some recommendations based on feeding. And I had mentioned, my background, we're all grass-based. I say loosely grass-based because my goats eat weeds and brush and so forth. But, in the terms of grass-fed, that's kind of our basis for how we're raising our goats. Okay, so moving on to minerals, goats, this one is a little bit more straightforward, but goats have specific needs, just like sheep or cattle do, and so it's important that they have access to a mineral mix. And I really recommend a loose mineral mix that's specifically formulated for goats. Or if you're going to get a different mineral mix, make sure it's comparable to the nutrient analysis that's on the back of the goat. Like if you look like at a goat, like for example, we used to purchase Purina goat mineral, and it's a pretty good mineral, but we're now using Purina's cattle, wind and rain mineral, just because it's a little more economical and it's got a little bit more copper in it, and it has like an anti-caking component to it. So since we raise our goats on pasture, it's just nice to, it's a little more usable for us. But, it's important to pay attention to copper and selenium levels, especially depending on where you live or throughout the country. There's, in certain parts of the country, there's different soil deficiencies geographically, and that can influence feed quality, whether it's your pastures or you're buying hay from a certain region or even making it yourself. A little bit later, one of the resources I have a link to an article that has some of the different maps, but copper and selenium seem to be more of a challenge for goats, and so that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at mineral mixes as well. And we also, I don't have it on here, but we also provide a supplement of sodium bicarbonate, really, which is baking soda. You can buy it in a big bag, like for 50 pounds at a feed store. And that's really as a way to kind of like a rumen buffer. So if they eat too much of something, it's kind of a way for them to maybe take like a Tums to kind of help them kind of recheck where they're at digestively. So now I'll move into some health considerations, and as you probably know, I am not a veterinarian, so I just like to bring that up. So, nor do I claim, to make any claims that way, but I think it's a lot of my recommendations are based on work that from our veterinarian, some other medical resources and so forth. But yeah, and on that note, if you're raising goats, if you don't have one already, I'd really recommend finding a good veterinarian. And even if they don't know goats, which I know sometimes is a common kind of complaint among goat folks, which I will say that too, still find one, because they still know vet medicine. They can prescribe medications if you really need them. And they have access to resources they can consult with. Our veterinarian works with a couple goat herds, not a lot. But when we've run into issues, he's consulted with some of his like old vet school colleagues that have maybe more sheep experience. I know sheep aren't the same as goats, but when it comes to some health issues, they're probably the best comparison to utilizing resources. And so part of it is establishing a relationship. So if you run into issues, if you're raising goats, at some point you probably will. It's easier to make a phone call and ask questions, or ask about a prescription, or troubleshoot something over the phone, or figure out if it's worth having a farm call, or if your goat is not too big or too wild that you could even load it up if the timing works, in a truck and bring it in. Once in a while we'll do that. I prefer not to, but it works. You can't do that as easy with larger livestock, but but then you have a good relationship, and it's worked well for us, because there's times where I may call in and ask some questions, and I'll go pick up some medication, or I may decide, okay, well then I'll check back with you tomorrow and we'll decide what we're going to do. You can't really do that if you don't have an existing relationship. They're good to consult on parasite issues if you need to do some fecal samples. If you have issues with kidding, hopefully you never do, but once in a while that happens. We've had to have a couple C-sections. That's obviously not in my wheelhouse. That's a veterinarian work. So there's, they can be useful, obviously, in that piece, respiratory issues, and so on. And for us, how we've kind of established a regular relationship without, aside from like as needed, is that we have our vet out once a year to do our annual herd health checks with our working guardian dogs. And so then we'll do a walkthrough with our herd health with our goat herd. And that's kind of where we usually touch base on things. And so that seems to have worked really well for us. I would say too that, over time, as I've worked with our veterinarian, there's some things I don't call for anymore, just based on what he's recommended, and I've kept a log and what's worked well. And so there's some things I can assess based on our relationship, past relationship we've worked on. I know we're talking about getting started with goats, so this isn't like the most exciting thing to talk about, but if you happen to have some goats that go down, or maybe a couple of them that you think there might be a bigger health issue going on, if you have your veterinarian out and the goat doesn't make it, I would highly recommend doing a necropsy. It doesn't sound great, but a necropsy is where they, and this isn't something where you need to send it into a lab, but even you could, but they'd open up your goat. It's hard to think about right now, but there's so much you can learn from what's going on inside the goat besides just what you look at on the outside. So if you have a goat that had an issue and your veterinarian's there and they can open it up and take a look to see if there's some other issues going on inside, that might be very telling in terms of how you might change some management practices. If it was a health issue that's impacted by nutrition or parasites, it can really help you a lot, because typically we're looking at our goats from the outside. So it's something just to mention that not everybody likes the idea of that, but you can learn a lot. Hopefully you never have to be in that situation, but something to keep in mind. In terms of what to look for with your goats, when you're always observe their behavior and body condition on a daily basis. So when I go and take a look at my goats, I take some time. It doesn't have to be hours, but I take time to kind of watch what they're doing. I see if anybody is like off on their own or how they're behaving. Health issues for goats can show up fast, and usually when there's symptoms or signs are showing that they're, it might be too late, or the issue has already been kind of festering and you just don't know that. And then also have, like on your supply kit, which, with your goats, you should have a thermometer, but, checking the temperature is always a good thing as well too, when you're thinking about being observant. And usually when I talk to my vet, he's asking me about a temperature as well. In terms of signs of a healthy goat, so I had some questions when I was kind of asking about what people wanted to see for this. This was one of the questions that came up, and this is from a book that I'd recommend if you don't have it and you're getting started with goats, Holistic Goat Care. I'll share the cover of it afterwards. It's been a really great resource for me. It's a newer book. It's kind of a balance of modern medicine and a holistic approach. And so you can, the author dives into this a little bit more on these signs, but these are things that you want to look for in terms of what, what's a healthy goat, or if they're off, maybe, what aren't they doing that's here? And so that's, you're looking at their demeanor, their posture, their eyes and skin coat, their body condition, and their feces. And so if something's happening, it may be then a result of something else going on in their body. And that can give you some feedback in terms of doing some research, for example, in that book or other veterinary books, or consulting with your veterinarian on, if you're having some of these signs. For example, skin and coat sometimes it could be due to external parasites, it could be a mineral deficiency. And so it can give you some clues on what issues you might need to address. And with goats, unfortunately, you can't go without saying, you gotta talk a little bit about parasite management. So goats are, parasites can be an issue if they're not managed, or kind of kept and managed effectively through both management practices and also if you need to, utilizing dewormers. And but the challenge with this is that parasites are also resistant to a lot of the dewormers that are on the market. So you really need to be conservative with utilizing dewormers, yet proactive. When I say conservative too, I'm getting it more at not doing like a partial dose if you're going to use them, but not using them, let's say like on a monthly basis. Just using that as just an example. And, a lot of times if there are health issues with an animal, it's typically related to parasites. It's not always the case, but usually more often than not, the parasites weaken the immune system, which then start to cause other issues to happen. And so if I suspect something, a lot of times we'll do a fecal sample. And so you can collect that yourself from the goat and put it in a little Ziploc bag and label it. And then your veterinarian can take a look under the microscope and give you an idea of what kind of parasites you're dealing with. So then you have an idea of how to address that. FAMACHA is a process. I've got the next page, it'll have a link on how you can get trained in there, but it's looking at how you look at signs with the color of the eyelid for the goats in terms of managing in particular barber pole worm. And so that's another process. And then also, be aware that like parasites are always exist in the animal, but it's really when you have a stressful time that stress may activate them. So we tend to see more issues, or I know to watch for it more around kidding time, or when goats go out, or right after they kid, or they go out onto pasture with new kids the first time. So I kind of keep an eye on them that way. What else was like during weaning time, as the pasture quality starts to wind down, sometimes that can be more susceptible if you move them or you bring in new animals, and there's kind of like the herd's establishing hierarchy. So sometimes those different times are when they can kind of pop up. So it's kind of good to be aware and kind of watch the general herd health. And part of the process too is continuing to build a healthy herd. So if there's some animals that continue to have issues with parasites, they're probably at some point that you probably should retire them from your herd. If you're looking at how you manage it also from a management perspective, if you're utilizing pasture and grazing, with rotational grazing, not doing continuous grazing really helps. Continuous grazing is where you just put them out there and they stay out there for a long time. But if you're moving them to new paddocks every 1 to 4 days, that really can help a lot in terms of not they're staying there for a short period of time where the parasite cycle doesn't restart and they're reinfecting themselves. There's some different pasture different varieties of plants that also that have some initial research that's showing potential for anti-parasitic capabilities. And so we've incorporated some of these into our pasture. Some of these also are ironically considered invasive species. So depending on where you're at, that may or may not be a possibility. But, you know, for how we really take our approach, we take a holistic approach. So we will deworm as needed if a goat is showing signs visually. So I look at body, you know, condition, if they're scoury or they're famacha, so looking at the color of their eyelids. But then we will do, twice a year, we will do a more formal like look over. So when we get ready, like about a month before kidding, we will go through our whole herd and take a look at animals and assess if anybody needs, you know, formally assess all the goats and make sure that if they need attention, we'll take care of it then. If they don't, we don't worry about it. And then we also do that before breeding as well. We also use copper boluses too, which are good for providing extra copper into their diet, but then also they're supposed to have some type of benefit with, there's a little bit of research behind this too with managing barber pole worm as well. I won't talk a lot on hoof trimming, but I know there were some questions about that. There's a resource here that has a nice video and points out different approaches. You know, depending on how you're raising your animals, it could be annually, it could be 2 to 3 times a year, depending on, you know, your genetics. If they're on rocks or out in the woods quite a bit where they're climbing around, they may wear them down. We found that we've had some goats that we started with in our herd that just genetically, they don't have great hooves or they grow really fast. And so we're working to try to keep that in mind as we look at how we manage our herd going forward.
Leslie, I don't know if this is a good breaking point, but there are a few questions that have come in.
Yeah, great.
One is, when purchasing goats, is it important for them to be registered? And of course, you can address these later too, but that's one, and does it matter if they're registered?
Yep. All right, yeah, so the registered, so for what we're doing, I've actually, and everybody has different, it depends what your goals are. And so I've found that having registered animals for what we're doing isn't that important for me, because all of our animals, we're selling them, they're going to meat. And then we're also trying to build a hardy herd that does well on pasture. So for us, registered doesn't really hold a lot of value. But if folks are raising animals that are going to be used, let's say for fair animals, or you might be interested in selling breeding stock, sometimes there's some value in it in that regard. I tend to be more in the camp that it's not as important, but if you look at my perspective of what we're doing, you know, for our farm, it makes sense. That's the perspective that I have. But some folks, you know, it's a way to demonstrate, you know, your quality of your animals and your livestock. So, I mean, there's a market for it, but depending on what you're doing, it may not be as necessary, but in some regards it may be.
And then some other questions, Leslie, and it looks like you might be getting into this a little bit, but do goats need help with kid delivery? How would you take care of a baby goat whose mother fails to wean? And then one back to the mineral question, how much mineral mix should you provide for your goats?
Yep. Okay, so on the mineral mix, we put it out free choice. And so that one picture I had back there was a mineral feeder that we use. There's some other ones that you can mount on the fence. I would say always have the mineral out all the time for access. And then it kind of depends, like if for some reason I didn't refill it or I missed that it needed to be refilled and they were out for a few days, or we were just moving on, it may be the section of pasture didn't have as much. Like there's times where they will like go crazy on it, and sometimes they'll just let it be. And so it's best to always have access, and they'll regulate how much they need. And then we take that same approach with us, the baking soda as well too. On the weaning, so on kidding, I'll talk a little bit on this slide, and then I can kind of talk a little bit about that too. So, you know, if you talk about goats, you can't have information on kidding. And so that again, kind of like feed, this is one that probably really is really worthy of a whole class in itself. The book I talked about, The Holistic Goat Care, has got a lot of great resources. goats, it takes about 5 months for them to have their babies. They tend to be seasonal breeders. You know, they tend to have twins. So you've got some of those resources there. In terms of kidding help and weaning, so I found that like our first-time moms tend to need to have maybe a little help, or I need to supervise a little bit more, or just monitor what's going on. Just because it's their first time. Most time their maternal instincts kick in after they have them and they know what to do. Once in a while we will get one or two that like are kind of like, what the heck just happened? And so we have to kind of help with the bonding process, and that's part of the reason why if they aren't in a kidding pen, so it's a small pen, we'll move them into a pen to get back to bond for the first 24 to 48 hours. And that really helps, especially those ones that may not be as interested in it. You know, for helping it. So part of the reason, so like when we're breeding, thinking about who we're going to breed or who we might retire from our herd, we're also, you know, part of the process too is also looking at who has been a good mother and also who hasn't had a lot of trouble kidding. And so that's something that we keep in mind. Of course, it doesn't help you when you have the problem, but it kind of helps in the big picture sense. I found that, so like when we first started, we kidded in January, and we're in Wisconsin. So like January is one of our coldest months. I don't think I'll ever kid in January again. And then we bumped it back a little bit. Now we're kidding in like the spot that seems to work well is like end of March, early April for us. It's kind of the end of like, we're coming out of winter. It's not super cold. And I found that, you know, in some of you who are in warmer climates, this may not be as an issue, but when we were kidding, when it's really cold, that's when we ran into more issues. And it was more important for me to be there and drying off those kids. And so now, and kind of helping them get started. And so now that we've been kidding later in the season when there's less cold weather concerns, you know, I'm still monitoring when they're kidding, but like I've hardly had to do any assisting with kidding help. I still want to make sure, you know, and I'm checking on them to make sure that there aren't issues, but there's much fewer issues when they have the time to kind of go through the normal label process, and I'm not concerned about, you know, how long it's been because of along with the cold weather kind of pushing on there. So the only thing I really do now with help is once the babies come out, I usually will help wipe them off with a towel if I'm there. And that just really helps. That way they can kind of get moving, and then I'll let the moms do the rest. But you know, that book has some good guidance. Doesn't mean that there won't be issues. Now that I'm saying that, I may jinx myself for next spring. In terms of weaning, you know, we've kind of taken the approach to either like self-wean. So we usually will, 3 months is when we wean roughly, but we usually will sometimes wait a little bit longer. But kids, we pulled them off about 3 months of age. I think going forward in the future, we've kind of gone back and forth in this, but I think we'll probably start castrating and let them stay longer with the whole herd so they're weather, so we don't have to be concerned about breeding. But when we wean, though, we will move them into a separate area so they're not calling back and forth. I know sometimes there's some folks will use fence line weaning so they're, you know, they can still see each other, but we haven't really been in the situation where that works really well with our grazing. So that's kind of where we've been at with wean and so forth. So, okay. So here.
There are some other questions.
Yep.
What is the acreage, specific to what you do, what is the acreage of your operation, and do you raise other animals as well?
Yep. So we have 140 acres, and we have 20 acres in permanent pasture. And so that's where we're doing predominantly our grazing in our herd. I had mentioned is about 40 animals. When we did our grazing plan with NRCS they had said we probably, like with our acreage, probably could run like about 125 does with kids on that acres. We eventually, we have about 40 acres in hay. Eventually I'd like to start doing more grazing and moving the goats into the woods that we have as well, to kind of convert that into silvopasture and do some brush work. We just solely raise just goats. At one time, we also had some turkey, like pastured turkeys, but my husband has his own job, and so to keep to keep our marriage happy, I focused on just one species of livestock. I just get more. So I kind of joke about that. But, you know, I think at some point it might not be that unusual for us I wouldn't be surprised if we had sheep at some point, just because they're very similar in management practices and our equipment. We may add a little bit of cattle at some point, just because some of our value added products are blended with beef. And so there could be some value in that regard. But for right now, we're just the goats. But the goats can really, if you're looking at the grazing models, goats can be a great species of livestock to kind of stack onto your other enterprises as well.
Right, and Leslie, is it common or possible that you could find another farm where you could keep your goats and pay them to keep them for you and care for them, so you wouldn't have to buy your own property?
I'm sure there probably would be. I know there's folks who do like contracted grazing, well, for brush service, or, you know, for goats in particular as an example, but then also it's the same thing even with cattle, I think, from a grazing perspective. But yeah, you could, and I mean, I think there's folks I know here who are getting started farming, and they rent out other like barn facilities that aren't at their, you know, where they live. Well, they may live there or too, but, you know, there's different situations where they may rent farm space and have their animals there, and they're caring for them. There may be situations too where you could work with somebody for them to help care for them as well too. Mm-hmm.
Great. Do you butcher your own goats, sell them live, process them, and sell the meat?
Yep. So for our goats, we don't butcher them ourselves because we're direct marketing and we're selling, you know, because of our state laws and federal laws, because of how we're selling them, we need to have them processed in a USDA inspected facility. Our meat, because we're close to the Minnesota border, it goes across border. You know, we sell into the Minnesota, and now, you know, we sell broader. So we have we have a butcher facility that works with us to do that and do cut and packaging. We have sold goats live for the purpose of folks doing their own butcher or processing at home. We choose not. It's not that uncommon for, if you raise goats, actually, there's folks who will do on-farm processing. So folks will buy the goat and then do the processing on farm. We've chosen not to do that. Sometimes the interpretation in Wisconsin, the rules have been interpreted differently over time. And so now that is acceptable if you can document transactions. But I know in some states that's not always the case. So if you're thinking about something like that, I would always check to see what the rules are. Let's see. But yeah, that's, I'm trying to think what was else on that question. If I can.
Let's see. Do you butcher your own, sell them live, process them, and sell the meat?
Yep. So we sell the meat. We sell the cuts of meat. We're doing more like bulk packages of cuts of meat than we are like a whole goat. Then versus like selling a whole goat, like in collaboration with a butcher, if you think like a half a steer, half, you know, a whole hog. So.
And what is the suggested pasture space per goat?
Yep. So maybe what I'll do is I'm going to move into the next area, and then I'll get into some of that a little bit. But I'll get to that one as well too.
Sounds good.
Well, you know what? If there's just those two, because I just opened these up. So suggested pasture space per goat. So when I get into the grazing area, I'll point out one of the resources. But there's it really depends on the like quality of the pasture and how much you have, the time of year, and how many goats you have. So they call a stocking rate. There's a calculation on how to do that. That gives you an idea. Now over time now I kind of have an idea of what our land can handle. So then we kind of, as we do small paddocks, we can kind of eyeball it. But if you're looking at from a perspective of pasturing, that resource that I'll show in just a little bit can give you an idea of that. And then, okay, I pulled up these as well too. So, okay, equipment you would suggest buying used versus new. If you have access to buying used equipment, I think that's great. A lot of times, materials for goats, like so our pasture shelters, we've bought all those used or we've made those on our own. But like for our round bale hay feeders, we purchased those new just because we found, like, for example, ones for cattle are worthless for goats because goats will climb into them. So like hay feeders probably are better to buy new, but some other, like, if you can find equipment that's for sheep and goats used, I think that's great because a lot of sheep or goat stuff is pretty expensive. Or if you can, modify equipment for cattle. Okay, and then I'll grab this other question, then I'll keep moving so we don't run out of time, but we'll still make sure we have time for continue to do questions. Okay, so where did you have your goats processed, and have you had difficulty during the pandemic getting butcher appointments? So we, in Western Wisconsin, a lot of the farms in our area that do direct marketing like we do, have worked with Black and Cleaver in Siren, Wisconsin. And so we've worked with them for quite a while. So we've had have a long-standing relationship and appointments booked out, but we've always had to plan well in advance. But with the pandemic, things, definitely the time of year where we might have been easier to get into, like in summer, definitely we've had a lot more delays. So that's been a challenge. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of pressure on that. Thankfully, they're continuing to work with us, but we'll see how that continues with the definite interest in local food, which is good, but it makes it tough on finding space to get in there and plan ahead. What brand of big round baler feeder did you purchase? So we have been getting round bale feeders from Ketchum Sheep Equipment. They're in, I believe, southern Wisconsin. They're red. They make red equipment, but they're a collapsible bale feeder that has 4 sides. So if you took it apart, it looks like 4 panels, and they have vertical spacing. They work well because the goats stick their noses in it, and they still waste hay, but not like what they used to. Okay, so I'm gonna take out the chat. Okay, so this last one, I'm just gonna point out here. Okay, so you'll find some resources here as well. So afterwards you can follow up you can take a look at those as well. So in terms of rotationally grazing, so some of you talked about brush management work, and so some of the concepts for brush management work is very similar to rotational grazing, except it's a little more intensive. We want to, as grazers, we want to have our pasture grow back. You want to you want to maybe kill it or set it back. So you might be a little bit more intensive in your approach. But we talked about fencing and energizers and shelter and cover and water already. Predator protection. So we have 3 livestock guardian dogs. I would say that a lot of folks who raise goats think they need to get guardian animals, and I think they're important. But I think kind of maybe think a little bit about how your setup is going to be before you decide to jump in and get them. They can be a lot of work and take some time to train, and may not necessarily be necessary initially. But you need to know, like, if in terms of what your wildlife might be dealing with in your area, or if they're on pasture or in other areas, where you're not around as much. There's not a lot of other activity. You kind of have to look at what other factors that come into place. And so we've decided to add dogs to our herd early on because we were looking at doing grazing. And we chose dogs over donkeys or llamas. We had a donkey for a little while, but I almost got kicked in the head. He was so excited. So after that, I'm like, he can't be here. He was my father-in-law's donkey that lived on his farm as a companion for my sister-in-law's horse when she was in high school. And so he had a home to go back to. But I think he was so excited about having mineral and pasture and being around the goats and extra attention that it just became kind of more of a hassle. And he stepped on some of our goats, and we had some issues that way. The dogs, but that was that one particular donkey. I know some people have good luck with them. So the dogs I've liked because they're also good with aerial predators. And so there are some times where we may have goats, we'll have young stock on pasture. So we don't want to, we don't want like an eagle or a hawk to carry them off. And so they do a good job of keeping them at bay. there is a book that I'll share in the grazing resources guide that talks about livestock protection dogs. I would recommend that as a resource. And then also, if you're looking at sourcing dogs, and we can do follow-up questions after, really make sure that you're looking at sourcing dogs from herds that, from like working farms that where they're being raised with the livestock. Make sure they're guardian breeds. And it's okay if they're a mix of breed, but they need to be a mix of all the guardian breeds, just because they have a lot of instinctual traits that are a part of them, that it's important to have that component. And they really need to live with your animals full time. I know it's hard, like our first puppy that we got, I felt bad leaving it in the barn like overnight, but that's, they have a job, and getting used to, we want them to respect us and work with us, but their first job and duty is to their herd. And so I know it's hard when you've been used to having pets to do that, but I think it's really important for them to be effective they live with their herd full time. Again, people have different opinions, but that's where I'm at. So, all right. So I'm just looking at my time here. I'm just going to keep moving along because I know I haven't got to uses yet. And I want to have opportunity for some more questions. So on rotational grazing approach, you talked a little bit about parasite management. Somewhere between 1 to 5 days is ideal. So you're not running into issues with parasites. And you don't want to return back to that area where they were at for at least 30 days, if not more, because then the parasite's life cycle is less of an issue for them to get reinfected. The stocking rate is what I talked when people had asked about, like number of goats per acreage. And so this Profits for Pasture guide is a nice one. There's a link in this presentation that you'll get later, and that has a good calculation in terms of how to calculate stocking rates. So for example, I think one of you in Texas, what you might have for access to pasture rangeland is going to be different than what we have here in Wisconsin. So some of those numbers might be a little bit different as well. Okay, so there's some of the resources for grazing that you can follow up on. And then I'm going to go into the opportunities with goats. And so a lot of these this is going to again be a high level, just looking at the time here. Okay. At a high level kind of piece, just to get an idea of what you can utilize your goats for. So obviously there's your personal use. But if you're looking at utilizing them, to produce some type of income or supplement income, there's kind of a couple different angles. It can be within a commodity. So that's really like after you do all the work to raise them, you're selling your goats, let's say, to the livestock market, and a buyer buys them for meat. If it's dairy, you're selling your milk commercially to a processor. And from the wholesale and direct market, and this kind of works its way up, there's a little bit more work on your end for building relationships with buyers and individual customers, but there's also opportunity for greater income. And so that kind of works its way up with, and that's really true with probably any of these avenues with goats. So I have them a little more heavier on meat just because that's what we do. So goat meat goes by many names. And most of the meats in the US you find in a grocery store is from Australia, if you can find it. The market itself is pretty a diverse cultural base. And we found too that there's a lot of interest in the local foods market as well. Butcher weights and ages and desired breeds, it really depends on your market demands. Excuse me. For us, so like in our area, our livestock market, the weights tend to be goats are about 50 to 60 pounds, but live weight. But for us, for selling to our customers direct, we've actually found that harvesting the goats at 80 to 90 pounds works better for us because our customers are expecting larger cuts of meat, more meat. So then, if they compare it even to the meat they might get from a lamb that was harvested, a lamb is still considerably larger than a goat. And so, the chops are smaller, everything is much smaller. So if we raise the animal a little bit larger, it can kind of help maximize a little bit without, those cuts, but then also the goats themselves are pretty expensive to process, and that goes true in terms of the cost per pound versus other meat as well. And they take a lot more time because they're smaller for the butcher to do the cuts. So that's also part of the reason why we raise our goats a little bit to a larger size. There's some trends in terms of tenderness and so forth. Usually under an age, they tend to be more marketable for meat, or that's more the ideal age. But older goats can be marketable too. I'd probably stay away from intact bucks just because they, for probably reasons, they tend to be a little bit less ideal for meat than maybe, let's say, older does as well. Other opportunities with meat, when you really look at the nose to tail use, the full use of the goat, we sell bones and organ meats. The raw pet food market is continuing to be a growing market. Hides, skulls, fiber, if they're dual purpose. So if you think of it more from a breeding animal perspective. And if you're looking at getting into doing direct marketing, I just recommend, making sure you follow up on rules and regulations for sales, and also even processing rules. So some of these folks here are good point people to talk to figure out what is specific for your area, because even some rules really vary by county as well. And so each of these examples, there'll be some other farms or businesses that you can follow up and take a look at what they're doing in this area. So there's some goat meat resources here that you can take a look at. This goat cooking and eating is a great goat meat cookbook that I really like. I point a lot of people to the butchering cookbook, or not cookbook, guidebook. While we're not doing butchering ourselves, I found it to be a great resource to help understand the butchering process and also communicate between customers and our butcher as well. So on the dairy side of things, there's the obvious what you eat, the milk and cheese, but then also soaps and lotions are another avenue with utilizing the goat milk. There's artisan and farmstead or the commercial side of things. In our area, I've really seen growth on the farmstead side, and that I would say be true with cheeses and even in that regard. There was a lot of growth in the commercial herds, but that really seemed to hit a plateau the last couple of years. And again, in this area, I think if you're looking at direct marketing or making your own product, some of these folks, these offices are good resources to get you pointed in the right direction. So Erin, if you're interested, at EB Ranch, she lives about a half hour from me. She raises goats, and one of her products that she sells, she makes goat milk soap, and she's actually going to be leading that class through the farm table next month as well too. So if you're interested in learning how to do that. And so some dairy resources are here. So some are more on the soap side of things, some are more on the cheese, and the art of cheese is, making your own cheese at home. If you want to start, the Penn State article actually does a pretty good job of kind of talking through if you're looking at establishing your own processing on farm. And then fiber is another opportunity. I'd say it's probably less profitable as it had been in the past, just because there's not a lot of, I'd say, money if you're strictly for like wholesale. But there's tends to be a segment with another farmer in our area, a growing market with local direct sales. So she's seen a lot of growth with cashmere fiber because they're kind of, you think of like with meat, they're competing with imported cashmere from China. And so local fiber artists are really interested in buying fiber that's from animals here in the United States. There's some fiber resources. And then on brush management services, so it talked a little bit about this, that's pretty similar to rotational grazing practices, but more intensive. There is a really high demand for these services and waiting lists. The Munch Bunch is Dan and Elise run that business. They live about a half hour north of me, and they're super busy all the time, and there's a lot of interest in that business. And so if you're interested in that area, the Sustainable Farming Association, this website has got a lot of great resources and some research that's been going on around using goats for ecological services. Also, highergoats.com has a listing of a lot of different kind of contracted goats that are goat herds that are out there. So if you're interested in seeing who's doing it, maybe in your area, and doing some learning, that might be something to take a look at on that end. And so, you know, some other uses, I think somebody talked about goat yoga, their interest. I think there's, you know, companion animals, you know, with horses or other livestock, entertainment, the yoga. We partnered with a local college to do goat therapy, where the college students got to hold baby goats, you know, as like an end of this year kind of activity. Utility use, breeding stock, and so forth. And so there's a lot of opportunities where you can even layer this into what you're doing if you're interested. And then there were some questions people had asked about direct marketing tips. And so, you know, I think the big thing is, you know, being strategic, and then also really having a digital presence is really important. And the trends really are going to showing that you need to really focus on your website and your email list and supplement with social media. And you really utilize social media as a relationship building avenue. Didn't always be that, it wasn't always that route, but kind of think about it as social media as 80% sharing what you're doing, educating, inspiring, relationships, and then, you know, 20% selling. So that way, you know, you think about it as a, you know, as an individual basis outside of what you might be wanting to sell or do. You go online to kind of see what your friends are doing, maybe not to go shopping. And maybe once in a while you might kind of have that in mind, but really think about that, the branding in that perspective. So I will say thank you, and we will jump into some more questions. I know I kind of zipped through that last piece quite a bit, but I just note that if you're interested in kind of seeing what we're doing, you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. On my farm blog, I have a lot of articles that I've written over time about what we're doing on our farm for management practices. We also have an email list that just for folks who are raising goats, just to share what we're doing on our farm. And so you can find that on our website as well. But I'm gonna stop the screen share so I can kind of see faces and see if there's, did I stop it, Mike? Okay, good. I see somebody's head nodding, so.
Yeah, is dehorning goats recommended?
All right. Okay, so yeah, I'll take a look at these questions here. Okay, so dehorning goats recommended. So our goats are with horns, and I really like having the horns on the goats. Really, like from a handling perspective, it really works well, especially my husband will help sometimes. I call him the vacation farmer, weekend farmer. So like if I'm doing any animal handling work, I can, if I get a hold of a goat, I can use their horns as a handling tool, and it doesn't hurt them, but it works well that way. You kind of need to be aware that the horns are there, obviously. I can see where some breeds, like dairy breeds, after we raise them for a little while, some of their horns stick straight up, and that can be, you know, that I could see where maybe that could be a challenge. I think they do better when, you know, you dehorn early on. There's some articles I've read that talked about it. The horns are used, you know, to help manage heat. So, you know, we've kept them on, so it hasn't really been an issue. And then I will get into some of these questions, but just so I don't forget, I'm just going to just do a quick show and tell now that I've got the screen up of a couple of resources, and this will be in the handout. But this meat goat handbook is from Langston University. This has been a good resource in terms of a lot of things, like anything you could really think about in terms of meat goat management. They also have an online education training course that you can take. This is the holistic goat care book I talked about. I'd really recommend this if you have other goat raising resources. If you're interested in cooking, learning how to eat and enjoy goat meat, it may not be for everybody, but if you are, this is a good book as well too. This is the goat cooking and eating book. And then this is the butchering book I talked about by Adam Danforth. And I tried to find my livestock guardian book before I left home, but no luck. So, all right, so I'm gonna look back at these questions here.
The one that I see you haven't answered yet is, would an Australian Shepherd do well with guarding goats?
You know, Australian Shepherd. Is that, I'm trying to remember the different breeds of guardians. So one of the things too with working dogs is that there is a difference between guardian dogs and then dogs that herd. And so I believe I'd have to look that up because I think I might be getting them confused with an Anatolian, which is a guardian breed. So I would look up the Australian Shepherd to see if I believe that might be a herding dog. I'm just going off the spot right now, so hopefully I'm not wrong. But you know, I know folks who have got goats that the herding dogs work really well for them. But in terms of a guardian dog use, you'd need to have different dogs for different purposes in that regards. Okay. So there's question that came just to me. I'm starting a goat meat farm in River Falls. How many does should I start with? Buy them bred or raise them from kids? So when we got started, I started with probably about a group of 10 goats. That doesn't have to be like the magic number, but if you're new to raising livestock, starting with a smaller number of goats has some benefit, just so you can kind of get the feel of how kind of their life cycle and what you're watching for. If you've raised livestock before, then I think even though goats are very different than other livestock, you might have some ideas. You might be a little bit more comfortable in that regard. So the benefit of buying them bred is that, and if they've kidded before, is that they kind of know what to do. So we had when we started, we had the group was a mix of young goats and then a group of older does I've kidded before, and they kind of taught me how to kid. So like I wasn't as concerned about making sure they knew what to do because they were first timers. So if you do get some bred goats, having some that maybe were bred, it's your first time going through a kidding season, if they've already had babies before, that can be useful in that regard. The benefit of raising them from kids is that they have more time to adapt to your environment of your farm and your situations. So they might be, start off on a little bit better foot, but that doesn't mean that the older goats couldn't. And then somebody asked about how do you prevent headbutting? I guess I haven't had any goats. Well, I'm trying to think, did I have any? I don't think I've had any goats headbutt me, but headbutting in terms of each other, some of that's going to happen is they're kind of, they have the goats tend to have a hierarchy. So that's going to happen in some regard. I've noticed, like, as my breeding bucks are coming into rut, they're getting a little bit more, pretentious in how they treat each other. So it's something that maybe, making sure you have enough space. If there's a goat that's getting picked on, either consider like either the problem goat may need to be removed from the herd, or the one that is always picked on may need to go to a new home. Sometimes those are things that you may have to consider. So, and then somebody had asked if we have any breeding stock for sale now. Unfortunately, no. We're continuing to grow our herd, so all of our does that we raise, we're keeping because it's just we've been working hard to get to the stage we need to be at and building a herd that really works well in our type of management situation. But I would hopefully in a couple of years we'll be able to be at that place.
Great, Leslie. I don't see any other questions at the moment, so I'll just hop in here for a second to, you mentioned Goattober, which is sort of a month to celebrate and draw attention to goats, and at Farm Table Restaurant we do celebrate that. Last year, I believe we had some of your goats meet here and had some special dishes. So I just want to mention that you can give us a call at our restaurant or come on in, and also our website is there in terms of upcoming programs. And then it's essentially 8 o'clock, Leslie, but one question did come in here. Do you have full-blood boars, or are they crossbred?
Yep, and so our most of our boars now are crossbred. So like we started with boars that weren't registered, but they came from lines that were probably close to being full blood. But over time now we've integrated Kiko into our herd. So we like the look of boars for marketability and the meat structure, but we've bred in the Kiko herd just because they're a lot more hardy and much more resilient on pasture. So we're just asking a lot more of them. And we found that that the boars don't do at least in our area, that they don't do as well on pasture alone. Oh, and then where do we get our livestock guardian dogs before we're, Mike will send out the slides and recorded video. And then the livestock guardian dogs, we have gotten ours from other goat breeders. So you kind of have to figure out maybe checking on who, sometimes there's folks who are raising goats or sheep, sometimes will also breed their dogs. And so sometimes that's a good starting point. So if there's someone in your area or your region that where you'd got where they have dogs, you might ask if they know where they got theirs, or ask ours. Our first one came from Iowa, our first pair, and then our second pair came from another farm just north of here, but I don't think they're breeding anymore. So.
Okay, well, I believe it's a little after 8, folks. Any pressing questions, feel free to type it in. Otherwise, we should probably move toward wrapping up. Leslie will share the slides with me, and I'll send those out to you all along with the recording of the class and the resources that Leslie will share as well. So, Leslie, thank you very much for doing this for us. It's great to see all the interest out there in this.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for attending.
And we wish you well in your business and look forward to having your goats at our restaurant too, Leslie.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us, everybody. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks.
Have a good evening.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.